Hey everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Talon Paul. I'm from Illinois. I went to the Bible college, just finished, and have started my internship here at Timberland. You may have met my wife Rebecca, who is sitting up front with me. Did everyone get this handout? Did Andy hand those out? I have plenty more. I didn't know how many to make. Now, what do you say to somebody when they say that the Bible isn't a reliable source for truth? How would you argue for the reliability of the Bible?
For me, it depends on who I'm talking to. People take, especially skeptics of the Bible, take a lot of different reasons, different things that they hold as true. And I found that there are a lot of ways to help convince them if there is any openness to it. If they're completely closed, you can say anything you want to, they're going to laugh at you.
Right.
But there's a lot of things. This is something I love to look at. The things in history, things in science, things in literary arguments. There's so much there that we could spend.
Right. And like you said, there's a whole lot of information out there. And all you got to do is click a button now, and you can find everything. There it is. How many of you would... Gosh, this is so loud. Moving that down. How many of you would start with somebody from the text of 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16? It says, all scripture is God-breathed and profitable for teaching, reproof, correction, and training in righteousness. How many of you would start there?
If they don't believe in the scriptures, I don't know if that helps.
Okay. I don't think it's convincing to start there. I would claim myself as a skeptic until proven otherwise. I like proof and I like evidence for my arguments. I'll believe when I see it, and I believe firmly in the Bible because I do see evidence for it. Now, since there is so much information, it's going to be absolutely impossible to cover everything about the Bible in 30 minutes now. Right. I might have been able to cover everything. What I want to try to argue for you is the reliability of at least the whole Old Testament and the Gospels in one argument. Is it possible? I would say that Jesus' resurrection proves both of these things. Jesus, as a faithful Jew, would have believed in what they would have called the Hebrew Bible, which we know now as the Old Testament. And everyone knows that Jesus was a Jew. That's just a fact at this point. Everyone knows that Jesus was a Jew. The question comes down to, did he rise from the dead? And was he real? Some people say that he never even existed, that he's just a myth. And I will cover with you why that's just completely absurd. If Jesus rose from the dead, then everything else that he believed in, which the Old Testament would be included there, and the accounts of his life, which would be the Gospels, need to be looked at seriously. So I want to go over three things with you. I want to talk about some evidence for Jesus' existence first, because you got to start with the fact that he does exist. I want to go over the evidence for his resurrection. And then I'll talk about some of the arguments that have come up against the resurrection and why those aren't necessarily that great. So first, evidence for Jesus' existence. I gave you 3 non-Christian sources to prove that Jesus existed. And this is just a few. There are plenty more. The first 2 come from a man named Josephus. He was a Jewish historian who documented Jewish history after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so if he's a Jew, that means he wasn't a Christian, giving this more credibility. In this first quote from his book, Antiquity of the Jews, book 20, what is that? How do you say that? Book 20, it's 29:1. You can look it up. It says, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, and brought them before the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So Josephus is documenting what happened in the Jewish world, in Israel, for the Romans. And he mentions this man named Jesus, who was called the Christ. He mentions a man that had a brother named James. Yeah, he does say James. And so this account shows that at least Josephus recognized that there was a man named Jesus around this time. Let's look at the second quote from 1833, also from Josephus's Antiquity of the Jews. It says, Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was called the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. Once again, another reference to this man named Jesus. And he's documenting the story that this tribe of Christians, I kind of like that we're called a tribe, told about this man, that he rose from the dead and that he appeared to them alive, and then that the divine prophets had foretold all these things. This is what he is documenting as history, not myth. So that's the first non-Christian source that mentions Jesus, is this man named Josephus, who was a Jew. The second comes later on by this man named Tacitus. He was a Roman historian and a senator, and he's writing to the Roman Emperor Pliny the Younger in 115 AD. This is the quote from his book, The Annals. He said, Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So this man doesn't believe in Christianity at all. He calls them evil and that what they're spreading are complete lies. But he does recognize that there's a man who was tortured by a man named Pontius Pilate right around that time. Another non-Christian source mentioning this man named Jesus. More proof that he literally existed, that he was around. There was a man named Jesus. The four Gospels are in themselves proof that he existed. These are what are known as Greco-Roman biographies. And if four different people are writing about this one man, and they've survived thousands of years of persecution, being burned and trying to get rid of for thousands of years, they at least believed in this literal human figure named Jesus. And the fact that we've had thousands of years of faithful, persecuted Christians is a testimony in itself. We believe there was a real man named Jesus, and he's the most influential character in the entire world. He is. Over half of people now claim to be Christians in the world. So the fact that he's the most influential character in the world, this fact alone is enough to discredit anyone from writing him off as a myth. Almost everyone recognizes now, even the skeptics and atheists, there was a real man named Jesus that existed. To say that he was just a myth that somebody created is just ignorant and has no ground whatsoever against history and fact. Are these convincing for you? What are your thoughts on these existing? Yeah, well, yeah. I'm preaching to the choir here.
One of the things we talk about the Gospels all being, not only do they complement each other, but if we look at all of the copies of the oldest copies of the Gospels that we have, they are more similar. There are less discrepancies between every ancient copy that we have and are closer to the original date
Right.
than the works of Shakespeare, who we accept as his works. I could give you a whole list of other documents that we accept as literary being what was written. And they are so much further away from time span and from differences between copies that it takes a supernatural work to make them that similar, and that the only differences are in the prepositions and punctuation.
Right. There's just an overwhelming amount of support behind us. And it's all available to us now. I mean, like I said, at a click of a button, you can find everything that you need. And you can direct other people too. It's not difficult to find this information anymore. All we got to do is do a little digging for it.
Even for the non-Christian, the works that you mentioned, like Josephus, unless those people say, I don't believe anything ever happened, anything ever existed, those have to be pretty good proof that there was Jesus.
Right.
Even if they want to say, well, we ignore the four Gospels.
And there's other Jewish writings that the Sanhedrin courts that show their dislike of this man.
Right. And actually, we're going to go over one of those in my next argument against, evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And so let's move on here to talk about Jesus' resurrection. The fact that the tomb was empty. I am going to present for you, how many do I have? 3 arguments that Jesus' resurrection actually happened. The first account comes from, this guy's a Christian, his name is Justin the Martyr, in his dialogue with Trypho in 165 AD. And all these examples here document the fact that the Jews tried their best to cover up the fact that the tomb was empty. The Jews made it a mission almost to show that something else happened other than Jesus rising from the dead. They recognized that there was no body there, so they had to reason something out. Otherwise, what these Christians were saying was true, and they had to accept that and accept the punishment. So in this quote from Justin Martyr, he says, and he's writing to somebody that is a Jew, Yet you not only have now repented after you learned that he rose from the dead, but as I said before, you have sent chosen and ordained men throughout all the world to proclaim a godless and lawless heresy had sprung up from one Jesus, a Galilean deceiver, whom we crucified, but his disciples stole him by night from the tomb, where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he is risen from the dead and ascended to heaven. So Justin is saying here to Trypho, who was this Jew at the time, that the Jews said that the disciples stole the body and started spreading a lie that Jesus rose from the dead. Well, how else are you going to decide how the tomb was empty. Unless you accept that he rose from the dead. Like Andrew mentioned before, there was plenty of Jewish writings later on that recognize Jesus, and this is one of them. This is a terrible work. It's called the Toledoth Yeshu. It's almost a biography about Jesus from a Jewish perspective, and it is terrible talking about Jesus. I mean, they write him off as basically everything that's evil with the world. But this is what they say, and this is from the 6th century, so about 500 years after Jesus' death. It says, diligent search was made, and he, which is Jesus, was not found in the grave where he had been buried. A gardener had taken him from the grave and had brought him into his garden and buried him in the sand over which the waters flow into the garden. So over 500 years later, they still can't reconcile the fact that the tomb was empty. This guy says, well, the gardener took him and buried him somewhere else. You know? The fact being that there was an empty tomb, and they still couldn't figure it out. That's the point I'm trying to make, is that the tomb was literally empty from a historical perspective. And so these Jews are trying to figure it out. Also, from the ancient document, the Gospel of Matthew, I'm going to call it an ancient document because that's what it is. In chapter 28, verses 12 through 15, it says, when they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, you are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this should come to the governor's ear, we will win him over and keep you out of trouble. And they took the money and did as they had been instructed, and the story has widely spread among the Jews and is to this day. So, 3 accounts of these Jews trying to cover up or explain away why there was no body in the tomb. Well, if you're trying this hard to explain something away, that means it must have happened. There must have been an empty tomb for them to try to reason it away.
It's interesting that the first two ignore the fact that there were soldiers there guarding the tomb.
Right. Yeah. How did they get past the guards? yeah. They were sleeping. And we're going to go over a few of the arguments that try to reason away the resurrection after this. But until then, I want to give 2 more points to try to prove that Jesus' resurrection really happened. And the second one is the testimony of women. Now, this might sound strange, but given that a woman's testimony was regarded as practically worthless at this point in history, it is odd that the first people to witness the resurrection of Jesus are women. In at least Mark's account of Jesus' resurrection. If they're writing a myth, if they're writing something that they don't believe is true and made up, they would not have made women to be the first ones to see it. They would have made men. Because women's testimony didn't mean anything at this time. It's very different than today.
But it could also be said that God is saying women's testimony is important.
Right. And the Bible is years ahead of what the society was for women. I mean, it's phenomenal to see how much the Bible improved upon women's status throughout the whole thing. But the point being is that if they were writing this and they didn't believe it was true, that they were just making up a story, it would make sense to write it out as a man would have seen this. It's almost embarrassing at this time for a woman to be the first one to see him. Because why would Jesus appear to a woman? They aren't regarded as having equal status at this time. That point gives a lot of historical backing behind Jesus' resurrection, is that the women were the first ones to see him risen from the dead. Any thoughts before we move on to the last one?
I love my life.
Yeah. The third argument is that Jesus' disciples were literally persecuted for this message. It's well documented that those who proclaimed Jesus' resurrection went through excruciating torture. They were crucified, beaten, whipped, killed forever. They still are today. So the argument stands as this: why would they have gone through this and accepted death for this message unless they truly believed that they had seen the risen Jesus? If the original disciples knew that they had made it up, they would not have stood for this message. They wouldn't have gone to death, excruciating death at that, if they didn't believe it to be true. The answer: they believed Jesus really did rise from the dead. At least they believed it. And so they went on preaching this message even to the point of death. That gives backing behind Jesus' resurrection being accurate. So through this we see that Jesus was a literal human figure and that the tomb was empty. The tomb was historically empty, even from a non-Christian perspective. And that Jesus' disciples really did believe that he rose from the dead and appeared to them. And so they went on spreading this message about Jesus. Before I go on to some of the ways that people have tried to argue this away, are there any comments or thoughts? I know we all want lunch, so. Let's see how people have tried to reason away the resurrection. We now notice that Jesus was real and that the tomb was empty. So let's see how they try to argue it away. The first is the theft theory, and we've gone over that the disciples stole the body and made up this myth that he had risen from the dead. And we just covered why that just doesn't make sense. If they knew it to be a myth, why would they have gone to death and be tortured over and over again for something they knew that they made up? That doesn't make sense.
They were no different than we are. We're not very likely to fight for something we don't believe in.
Right.
And even if they did believe it, when he didn't rise from the dead, they'd be like, uh-oh.
Right. Now, if they did make it up, and they started spreading this around, and they got really popular, but then Roman guards start coming in and want to kill them and tell them to stop, if they really made it up, maybe it's time to call it a day. But that just wasn't the case. They kept going, and it's been going on for centuries, for thousands of years up until this point, and still goes on today, where people are being persecuted for something that they truly believed happened. So the theft theory doesn't have very good grounding at all. Can you agree with that? The second theory is what they call the swoon theory. They say that Jesus actually went unconscious on the cross and was not actually killed. And then he later rejuvenated in the tomb, woke back up, and then walked out himself. And then thus appeared to them to be alive. Well, what are your thoughts on that before we go further?
I think he might have woke up when he stuck the spirit inside.
Well, yeah.
It's pretty hard to stay out of it with that.
Any other thoughts?
I think the Roman soldiers that were there to make sure that the people that they hung on the cross were dead weren't going to be slacking in their duties. They were going to be sure that he was dead before they took him down.
Right.
Plus, we still got the two soldiers in the tomb.
Right.
Even if he could have walked out, they would have stopped him.
Exactly. You were going to say something, Andy?
The Islam believes in the is that right?
They believe Judas died on the cross instead.
And then
So,
they
yeah.
also one of the things I understand is that when their Quran and when they look at these things, historically they disagree with everybody else. That even just historical atheists stop and recognize that history is incorrect in that. And so when we're looking at, something being reliable, there are several different ways that we look at how something is reliable. And one of those is authenticity. Authenticity of what you say and historical accuracy. And I believe that's what the Bible has, and I believe that's what the Quran does not have, is the historical accuracy. And that's one of the biggest points, is that everybody else agrees that Jesus did die on the cross, that he was buried. And then whether they believe he rose again is the thing that's in question there. They know that his body was gone, but how that looks or how that works, they don't know. But they all do agree that this actually literally happened. And to go against that would just be not accurate.
Right. One fact is absolutely clear. Romans made sure that people were dead. I mean, they went through to extreme lengths to make sure these people died. Now let's just speculate and say that he actually did pass out on the cross and wasn't killed. He went through beatings. He was hung on a cross for hours on end. If he did rejuvenate in the tomb, there was no way that he would have the strength left to move the stone that was in front of it, let alone get past the guards that were standing out there. And if people saw him walking around, they'd obviously see that he was all beaten and bruised and could barely move at this point. This theory doesn't hold very good ground among critics. Even critics don't agree with this theory. It's not logical and it doesn't make sense. It's kind of, was it chasing after the wind? Grasping at straws? Yeah.
When you said that the women wouldn't have been the first ones to see him because women weren't given much credence and credit. In Mark, it says when the women told those who had mourned Jesus that they did not believe. It doesn't say that they, like other Gospels, that say they took off from the tomb. This particular, in Mark and King James, it just says they did not believe.
Yeah. And when you study the Gospels, you realize the first Christians were the worst Christians. They didn't believe anything. I mean, Thomas had to physically touch Jesus' wounds in order to actually believe that he was standing there in front of him. These people weren't good believers. And so, like your point saying, they didn't believe them. So, if the Gospels are myths, they would portray the disciples as being these extravagant believers, that these were the mighty men of the time. It's embarrassing to the disciples what's written. I mean, Peter's called Satan by Jesus. He says, "Get behind me, Satan." I mean, you don't write that about somebody unless, it's historically true. It's not, it doesn't give him much credit, and it doesn't sound like a myth that would have been written. Because in myths, it'd be like, in a galaxy far, far away, there was this great man and stuff like that. Not in here. I mean, it's crazy honest how these people write about the disciples and other people in the Bible. Moving on to our third theory is the hallucination theory. That those who saw Christ risen were just hallucinating. This one has a little more credit than some of the other ones, because we know that some people do hallucinate. For one, it doesn't give credit to the fact that there's an empty tomb. It still doesn't explain that. So that's a whole other topic in itself. Scientists today have actually concluded that only certain kinds of people have hallucinations, and they're usually attributed to paranoia or schizophrenia. However, Jesus appeared to not only only 12 different people, but over 500, as 1 Corinthians 15 points out. Over 500 people he showed himself to. It's absolutely absurd to think that this many people could have had the same hallucination at the same time about the same man.
Over a period of days.
Right. It's not logical. I'm a logical thinker. If things don't make sense, I have to try to piece it together in order to get it true. And if I'm wrong, then I'll try to find something that's right. But
That wouldn't even happen today with all the drugs that are available. We all took the same drug. We're not
Right.
all have the same hallucination.
exactly. Yeah, for 4 days. Yeah. And Acts points out that Jesus was with them for over 40 days, teaching them about the things of the kingdom of God. That long of a hallucination, really, with that many people? You had to have some heavy drugs if that's going to happen. That holds weak ground among critics as well, too. The last one I want to talk to you about is the unknown tomb theory, that the disciples actually went to the wrong tomb. I know.
If I were looking for it, I would.
Yeah. Okay, you're right.
When Jesus died on the cross, right?
Yep, there might have been other empty tombs around because the Gospels do say, at least in Matthew, that others did rise from the dead at this time when Jesus died. We're fortunate enough to have this information available. Joseph of Arimathea, he provides very strong evidence for us on this. He was the one who took Jesus into his own private tomb, as documented by Mark, and not some public mass burial site. So they had like mass burial sites that they would just throw all these criminals in and just get rid of. But not Jesus. We have documentation that this guy, Joseph of Arimathea, took him into his own private tomb. Also, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph or Joses, were watching where he was laid when this happened, as also documented by Mark. So they saw him getting laid in the tomb. They probably recognize where it's at. The Romans also knew where Jesus was buried, for they had guards posted around the tomb, and they had to pay off those guards to tell that the disciples stole the bodies away. Another weak argument, even among critics.
We'd also have to assume that all the tombs had guards.
Right.
Doesn't seem real plausible.
Right. They're not going to just take their troops to just stand around every tomb around the place. Here's the conclusion. Since there was an empty tomb, the only logical explanation left is that Jesus rose from the dead. And even atheists today say that there isn't really no explanation other than that this is a historical mystery. We don't know that it's a mystery. We know the truth. We have proof here that he rose from the dead. And since Jesus rose from the dead, there must be a God who rose him from the dead. And since Jesus rose from the dead, we need to take seriously what he taught and said, which is best documented in the Gospels. So if this man rose from the dead, we should probably listen to him. And the best sources that we have of his teachings are found in the Gospels, and that's my argument for them being reliable. And since Jesus rose from the dead, everything that he believed must be true. If God took the time to raise this man from the dead, the only one in history, which as a faithful Jewish preacher would have been known as the Old Testament. He believed in the Old Testament, and if he's risen from the dead, that means God put his seal of approval on this man, and we should listen to him. And what he preached from was the Hebrew Bible. So if you can prove Jesus was risen from the dead, then everything else should fall into place. The rest of the New Testament's a story in itself, and there's plenty of information for you to look up, and there's a lot of evidence behind us there too. And since most people now have actually heard the name of Jesus at least at some point in their life, this could be our conversation starting point. Because if we ask somebody, have they heard of Jesus? They're probably going to say yes. 9 times out of 10 in America, yes. They have heard the name. What did he teach? They're a little lost on what he taught too. He taught love, peace, and care for all mankind. That's the general answer is what they give. If we ask, did he rise from the dead? Well, that's going to spark conversation, especially among Muslims. Those might be our biggest evangelism resource right now, as some have actually argued, because they love talking about Jesus with Christians. If you can argue that Jesus actually rose from the dead, that proves everything about our faith. Everything hinges on Jesus' resurrection. And I think we have plenty of proof to show that it was true. Now, are there any other thoughts? I still made it in time for lunch, so look at that. Are there any other thoughts before we decide to break for lunch?
One of the, certainly like you said, one of the oldest debates ever. I remember a senior in high school, our youth leader was an assistant pastor, and he preached on the book The Passover Plot, which was written and published in 1965, and was later made into a movie by the same title in 1976, I think. The swoon theory, that Jesus just either put himself into a coma, Luke had slipped in some drugs, and he, became unconscious and later came out of it in the tomb, and the guards heard noises in there, and so the guards rolled away the stone.
Oh, okay.
And by the time they rolled away the stone and placed it and looked in, there was nobody there because, like he had snuck out while they were still rolling the stone. So I'm just saying.
Yeah.
People have been writing about that. The guy who wrote that book, Schofield, he wrote his own interpretation of the New Testament too.
No.
With a Jewish slant to it. So from the beginning of time.
Yep, and probably till the end. We'll be arguing this topic.
You believe what you believe.
And it's definitely not blind faith, because I'd say there's plenty of information there, but ultimately you do have to decide, well, I'm going to believe this way, and go with it. So.
We all here sitting here believe that when you take a sperm and an egg together, it makes the baby. How hard is that compared to raising Christ from the dead? If you believe that God is the master of the universe, I guess I don't struggle with atheists not looking at it, but people can believe in God of any, Jew, Muslim, whatever, but they can't believe this.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of unbelievable.
If he can raise the dead, he can do anything he wants. So. Right.
We take that for granted.
He had to talk about something.
It's kind of mind-boggling that we believe that a baby, can be made out of, two cells, but we can't believe that Christ was raised from the dead.
Right. Once again, have a lot of evidence on our side, but we got to start the conversation. We have to start talking to people about this. Because since these theories are out there, that means people are struggling with this topic. There was an empty tomb. How do we explain it? And if we can reasonably explain that Jesus rose from the dead, we've just made a convert. And that's our commission. So.
And with Easter approaching, this is a really good time for us to try to get that into the conversation.
Right. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Easter's coming up. So.
Resurrected, then all those donuts, juice, and coffee on Easter for nothing.
Yeah. or as Paul has said, we among all men are to be ashamed because we have believed in vain. So everything hinges on the resurrection. I think we're going to break for lunch. I hope this was convincing and helpful for you. And when we come back, I think you're speaking, right, John? All right. So good. Yeah. Oh. We should pray for the meal.
You can pray in just a second.